Morning, everyone. This is Deb Vaughn. I am the Arts Education Coordinator with the Oregon Arts Commission, and I oversee Poetry Out Loud for the state of Oregon. We are thrilled to, as Malka called it, make Oregon Poetry Out Loud history this morning with this series of webinars. What you can expect is for the next half hour, an introduction to the program and the contest. This is your 101 level class. We're hoping we have some new teachers here who are looking to start up Poetry Out Loud in their schools. So this will give you everything you need to know to get your first year going. Then at 9:30, we'll probably have some new attendees join us for our 201 level class. And those of you beginners that are with us, you're welcome to stay on the line for the 9:30 to 10:30 hour, where Mark will dive a little bit deeper into ways that you can integrate Poetry Out Loud more deeply into your classroom, stimulate additional student interest. Thank you. So we're excited for you to be here. A couple of technical pieces about this webinar. If you've not used the GoToMeeting interface and you're with us live this morning, you should have on your screen, you should see the Poetry Out Loud logo and Mark's title slide, but you should also have a little pop-up box, control panel here, and it has 3 tabs across the top. The one that says audio is probably the one that's highlighted. Once you're dialed in and can hear us, you don't really need that anymore. But below that, you should see one labeled chat, and it probably has a right-facing arrow next to the word chat. If you drop that arrow down, click on it, it should open a chat box. If you have questions during the webinar, you can use this chat feature to ask them. And Malka Geffen, who coordinates in the northern and central parts of the state, and Clancy Roan, who coordinates down in the southern part of the state, are on this webinar and available to answer your questions. So Mark, as you present, you can just focus on content, and between Malka and Clancy and I, we can address questions that come up. Also watch that chat box, because Malka is going to be putting in some web links for attendees that they can click on live. So those will emphasize the resources that Mark is talking about in his presentation. So with that, I'm going to mute my microphone. I'm going to turn over the presentation to Mark Turner, an experienced Poetry Out Loud teacher at the Center for Advanced Learning up in Gresham, who has coached many students to successful competitions at the state level, and one student 2 years in a row was our state champion from Cal. And Mark, thank you so much for doing this, and we're looking forward to your content. So take it away.
All right, thank you, Deb. Glad to be here this morning and to introduce people to Poetry Out Loud and the exciting program that it offers. I know for us, for our language arts classroom, and it can be well adjusted for a lot of other English type classes, libraries, homeschool, etc. So I'm going to get started here with the introduction to the program and to how to get a contest set up. So overall, this will be mainly just information about the Poetry Out Loud program and ways that you can bring it into your school or other educational program. Again, this could be an after-school program, a homeschool event, a local library, etc. A big part of using or implementing Poetry Out Loud is using their website. It's a place that we depend upon for the entire unit, and I'll be looking at various places on the website throughout this presentation and the next one to familiarize you a little bit with some of the main things that we use. And then finally, again, we'll be talking about how to set up a contest at your school. As Deb mentioned, my name is Mark Turner, English instructor, Center for Advanced Learning in Gresham, Oregon. I think this will be my 9th year with Poetry Out Loud. And yes, luckily we've had a lot of really great students who get really motivated about poetry, which has led to some good results at the regional and state level. And going to DC was amazing, and I hope that everybody could have a chance once to go to DC to see these amazing kids and their recitations and just their overall motivation. Very inspiring to go to DC. So there are some eligibility requirements with respect to participating in Poetry Out Loud. It is funded through the National Endowment of the Arts, and it is in all 50 states as well as some of the U.S. territories. It is a contest open to all high school students. It is free of charge to your school and to the students. And the main focus is encouraging students to not only learn about poetry, but also the skills of memorization and presenting in front of an audience. It does have a competition component to it, which also adds a dimension that is fun during the school year. And again, it does mention here, in addition to the National Endowment for the Arts, on the national level, the Oregon Arts Commission leads Poetry Out Loud for the state of Oregon. 2005 is when Poetry Out Loud began. I think at my high school, I wasn't here yet, but we started in 2006. Again, all 50 states and U.S. territories. And there are prizes on the national and state level. And I think here, just real quickly, in terms of those prizes, I'm just going to be referring back to this teacher's guide quite a bit. Well, in here is where you find out what those prizes are, etc. I'm not going to scroll through this a lot right now, but this is a key guide that you would receive upon registering your school or your program for Poetry Out Loud. So again, a school or program, a group of students, teachers, mentors, etc., do need to register their group, and that registration date is due January 13th of 2017. The Oregon Arts Commission has set up this registration page. It's an online form, and you click right here. I looked at this yesterday, and it allows you to complete this Google form to register your group, school, etc. Online. The other requirement is that students do need to choose poems from the Poetry Out Loud anthology. There are print versions of this. The print version does not contain all of the poems, but sometimes students like to thumb through the books, the anthology itself. Otherwise, we largely will be referring students to the Poetry Out Loud website, where you can search for all the poems, both through poem title and poet name. Since a lot of students typically don't know a lot of poets or poems other than Edgar Allan Poe and maybe a Shakespeare sonnet, over here there are other ways to sort through the poems, and I find that the random poem actually yields a lot of poems that students do choose and commit to, and have even carried them to both regionals and to the state competitions. I myself typically use the random poem to be introduced to new poets and poems every year. In terms of the competition component, since this is a contest, the students who are going to be competing need to at least be scored by at least 2 non-biased judges. So you probably wouldn't want Grandma and Aunt Betty to be the judges of your son or daughter. And then the judge criteria, and we'll talk about this later, is in accordance with the Poetry Out Loud scoring rubric, and that's what's used to determine how students place. And then also at least 2 students. To have a competition, there needs to be at least 2 people who are competing. Those are the requirements. There are recommendations you'll hear right here in these 2 bullet points, as well as other recommendations later. And that is that some instruction, coaching, and feedback on their performances. There are a lot of things that can really improve a recitation the more the students have awareness around things like tone and pacing, etc. And then also this other recommendation is that there's an opportunity for public recognition for this accomplishment. Reciting a poem, memorizing a poem is very difficult, and the point at which a student is able to do that and do that well does need to have some kind of acknowledgement or some kind of an audience because it is a sight to see and it's really hard to do. In talking about the contest and the sequence itself in terms of all of these stages and how a student might move beyond their school or after school program to a regional level, this is the information or the calendar for the 2017 Poetry Out Loud time sequence. Again, first there's that register online by the 13th, and later when I talk about implementing this in your curriculum, I really do recommend registering way earlier than that. I would say October, November. So school contests, local libraries, etc., those need to be finished and your school representative needs to be chosen by February 24th. There'll be another sort of registration sign up for your school or after school program representative for registering for the regional competition. And then that happens on March 4th. I think there are 3 regions in Oregon that have their own regional competitions. 3 students from each of those regions then would go on to the state competition March 11th, normally held in Salem. And then from there, a first place winner and a runner-up, in case the first place winner is unable to attend, would be traveling to Washington, D.C., April 24th to the 26th. The student does receive a small stipend. I think it's between $100 or $200. The expenses for the trip itself, hotel, flight, etc., is all covered, and they can bring one person with them, and their expenses, etc., are also covered. And again, that teacher's guide I mentioned does get into more of these details. So in moving forward and getting a contest ready and preparing your students, again, the Poetry Out Loud website is the primary source for all of these items here, helping students choose those poems, the Poetic Devices Glossary, a lot of video examples of previous state and national finalists, guidelines for running a competition, preparing judges, accessing the rubrics, accessing the images that you're seeing here in today's presentation. All of these things, all of these resources are contained in the Poetry Out Loud website. A big part of this, aside from educating teachers, mentors, homeschool parents, etc., is getting the students informed and motivated about poetry itself. And so this is a place that we spend a lot of our time at the start of the unit, not just for finding poems, but also watching these various series is really helpful, and then seeing examples. This one here has moving text in addition to the student's recitation, but throughout this particular page you get a lot of different examples and students just talking about tips in terms of memorizing poems and reciting poems. Additionally, you have a judge here giving some advice to students in preparing their recitations. So really helpful website. And then also, in addition to the website itself, Poetry Out Loud does have a YouTube channel, and this is where you will see, I have never counted them, but probably hundreds of videos going back to, 2008, maybe 2009, national, state, contestants and winners. So you can see everything from your national winner, what the so-called best recitation of the year looked like, as well as maybe students in your state or students that you knew about that you want to see. Langston Ward, definitely a highlight each year. Students really like his Walt Whitman recitation. And then finally, that teacher's manual, and I'll talk about this in the next presentation at greater length, has the lessons, printables, the contest evaluation sheets, etc., that we use extensively, and I'll get probably a lot more into that during the next presentation. So I'm going to move forward now in terms of planning for the school contest. And again, this is something, if you're doing it at the school level, you do have to look forward in your calendar to carving out a kind of a chunk of time, maybe if you're embedding this in the language arts classroom, or how you might start managing an after-school program. There's that registration deadline again. I guess the first thing, though, is you have to ask yourself, well, who's going to do the registration and set all this stuff up? So you do have to identify a team leader that will be the lead person for the registration and kind of getting everybody organized. From there, you start thinking about other dates in terms of all of the things that would have to prepare students and the other teachers. And so I guess you kind of work backwards from that February 24th date, and then you work backwards from there in terms of embedding it in your class, when you'll have your in-class competitions, when you'd have your school competition, when you would begin introducing the unit, etc. At our high school, we, at the start of the year, when we're tinkering with our curriculum map, we'll look at the deadline for the school competitions, and then we will just plan our unit accordingly as close as we can to that date so that everything is fresh in the student's mind between instruction and recitation. So most of this for us occurs during the month of mid-January through February is typically our Poetry Out Loud unit. Again, those alternatives to the design can occur in many different ways. I've seen Web Academy students who are meeting both online and periodically with a teacher to practice reciting poems, to your homeschool formats where you have multiple families organizing an event at the local library, etc. As long as you're able to meet those requirements and use the Poetry Out Loud online resources, you can shape this program to fit your needs, I think, quite easily. When it comes to the actual school competition itself, there are various roles that need to be filled to make that be a successful afternoon or evening. Here at Cal, we run ours in the evening, and we invite parents, friends of the students come, and it is always a really fun evening and a successful event. So earlier I said that you had to have at least 2 judges. One of those is an accuracy judge, and one is a judge using the contest evaluation sheet. And once those judges have been chosen, we then prepare them using the judge preparation page off of the Poetry Out Loud website. And so here you'll see various links like this one. A copy of this is provided to the judges, and there's that link there. But more importantly, there's a video here that I always have my judges watch. I send them the link ahead of time, and then usually they arrive early and there's another chance to review the video. And for those who maybe didn't get a chance to see it. So these are the resources that are typically used to help prepare the judges. Typically, we also like that judges listen to one recitation, maybe a student who's not competing, so they can kind of norm a little bit or calibrate their scores so there's not, I guess, a pattern of widespread discrepancies in judging. So you try to do what you can up front to get people to understand that rubric and to understand how that evaluation works and the accuracy component, just to have some consistency in the judging. So this is that judge's guide that is primarily used to prepare judges. This tips for judges is a very helpful list of bullet points to help judges, again, stay consistent, to be calibrated, and to also expedite the judging process, because if there's a lot of time in between performances, it can really make this evening drag on to be a really long evening. Other roles here, an MC, somebody who would announce each participant as you move through this. Usually we have 2 stages or 3 stages where students are reciting 2 poems at the school. They would be reciting 3 poems at the regionals and state and nationals. There is a prompter, and this is somebody who has a copy of the poem. As a student maybe forgets a word or a line, the prompter is there to give them a word or a line. And then we have a person called the score tabulator, who is collecting all of those evaluation sheets and scores, inputting them into a spreadsheet, and able to easily determine the hierarchy of scores through the evening. And that score sheet is also provided through the judge preparation website. Every year we just download the Excel spreadsheet. It's already been filled out in terms of the formulas. All we have to do is insert the students' names and the scores, and it calculates everything. Very, very, very crucial to organizing your event, especially if you have a lot of contestants. I think 2 years ago we had 19 students, each did 2 poems, so it's a lot of data and numbers. So this spreadsheet is invaluable. And then in terms of organizing the school contest itself, again, I'm going to go back to the website here, and this is the site that I use to organize the contest. Some of this, again, goes through those roles again. There is a PR toolkit right here. There are those roles once again. Again, I think for us having a larger competition at our school, we usually have about 4 judges and 1 accuracy judge. And then there's just other information here about some of the specifics once the contest is about ready to begin. Here's that Excel file, the sample tally sheet that is used to record all of the contestants' scores. Crucial resource right there. And finally, the Common Core standards are provided here in this presentation and on the Poetry Out Loud website. So I know when we look at our curriculum map and sort of lay out which standards and which units sort of go together, when it comes to the core language standards, these are the ones that our poetry unit addresses. And finally here is the contact information for Poetry Out Loud resources in the state of Oregon. Deb Vaughn, the Arts Education Coordinator, and this is the link to the registration for getting your program set up at your school. And that is the conclusion of this first presentation.
That's fantastic, Mark. Thank you. This is Deb at the Oregon Arts Commission. Again, just thank you for those who were joining us for this beginning presentation. And we are going to just pause for about 5 minutes, and we'll start the 201 level webinar at 9:30 in case some additional attendees are joining us. For those of you who are on the webinar, if you have any questions for Mark or any of the organizers, you can use the chat box to ask those. Again, you should have a small toolbar window for your GoToMeeting interface, and you may see a chat box with a right-facing arrow. If you click that arrow, it should then face down and open up a box where Malka and Clancy and I have been posting some notes. So feel free to type a comment in that box if you have a question for us, and otherwise we'll just go ahead and pause for a few moments until we hit 9:30 on the clock.
Okay, sounds good.
Right, Delana, I saw your comment pop up. Thank you so much for being with us, and for other staff members who may want to utilize this information. We are recording the webinars, and we'll send a link out probably to all of our interested teachers after the webinar concludes. So feel free to share that with other staff members, and now that you've seen the content, you can tell them which sections were of particular interest and direct them. The webinar recording will allow you to skip forward as needed, so you can direct them to the sections that might be most helpful in your school. Mark, do you want to go ahead and tee up your next PowerPoint presentation?
Yes. And are you watching me the whole time?
Yeah,
Or,
so don't check your email or your Facebook right now.
yeah, okay. And when I do the clicks on the links and you see the website and I scroll, is that pretty?
We can see that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, you're doing great. Wonderful. So we'll just give it another minute here, and then I will re-welcome folks in case we've got some new people, and then we'll get to it.
Okay.
All right. My computer just clicked over to 9:30, so we'll go ahead and get started with the second part of the webinar. This is Deb Vaughn. I'm the Arts Education Coordinator for the Oregon Arts Commission, and I manage Poetry Out Loud for the state of Oregon. We're joined on this webinar by our two regional coordinators, Malka Geffen, who works in the northern and central and eastern parts of the state, and Clancy Roan, who works in the southern part of the state. And we're pleased for you to be with us. We're making Oregon Poetry Out Loud history today with this series of webinars. If you missed the first half hour, we did a 101 introductory level webinar designed for teachers who are just getting started implementing Poetry Out Loud in their schools. So if you didn't get a chance to join us for that, and that would be useful, feel free to skip back to the beginning of the webinar. If you're just joining us now, the next hour will be focused on your 201 level. So this is designed for teachers who are wanting to deepen their students' experience of poetry out loud, increase student involvement, and explore more classroom curriculum links beyond just the bare minimum of utilizing a contest. During this webinar, while the presentation is going on, if you have questions and you're with us live today, you can utilize the chat box in your, you should have a tool pop-up bar from your GoToMeeting interface. And if you see the chat bar, it probably has a right-facing arrow when you first look at it. If you click on that arrow, the arrow will point down, which will open the chat box. All the microphones are muted, but you can use that chat feature to ask a question, and Malka and Clancy and I are here to answer those while Mark does his presentation. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mark Turner, an instructor at the Center for Advanced Learning in Gresham. Mark, I think you started doing Poetry Out Loud maybe the same year that I did, because I think this is my 9th year coordinating.
Oh.
So I don't know that we ever realized that we both started the same year, but Mark has a long history with Poetry Out Loud, and his school has a successful track record of sending students on to both regionals and frequently to the state competition. And for 2 years in a row, actually, Mark's student, Rosie Reyes, was the Oregon State champion and competed at nationals 2 years in a row. So Mark brings that wealth of experience to this webinar, and I'm going to go ahead and mute my microphone and turn things over to Mark.
Okay, thank you, Deborah, for a very nice introduction. Yes, 9th year Poetry Out Loud. It's been an amazing program every year. It surprises me every year. For example, Rosie Reyes, who Deborah just mentioned, was a dental student here at Cal, had never memorized a poem in her life, had barely any theater experience, maybe a middle school play, minor role. But she was so inspired by the videos that she was committed to memorizing poems and really, really worked at her craft. And the next thing you know, she's going to Washington, D.C., representing Oregon 2 years in a row. Since then, Rosie is in college pursuing medical school and still keeps poetry active in her life. She started a poetry club at Oregon State University. I know now she's transferring to a college in Boston, but poetry is still a big part of her life, which is pretty fascinating given that she's a medical student. So here we go. This is the integration of the Poetry Out Loud unit into a language arts classroom or an after-school program. A group of homeschool parents at a local library, etc., could adapt this program in all kinds of different ways. So when we introduce this unit here at Cal, we usually begin most of our units with an essential question, and for poetry, it's how does poetry communicate experience? Given that there are things that occur with the oral delivery of poems and how that communicates experience in ways that are different than words on the page. Throughout this presentation, there'll be some variations to the unit. The particular unit I'm going to be describing does include that students keep a journal, and they will have journal entries that they do turn in at the end of the unit. In years past, I have incorporated the poetry analysis essay. I stopped doing that probably about 3 years ago. Also, this particular unit I'm going to describe does include a unit exam at the end with respect to the poetic devices and forms. This helps us address some of the Common Core standards around language. The recitation of at least one Poetry Out Loud poem is something that does get assessed at the end of the unit. And finally, this particular unit, students do produce one original work, either a free verse, sonnet, or ballad, and that is one they both produce in writing as well as read out loud in preparation for their recitation. So down there at the bottom, then it just talks about that students will recite one poem in front of their classmates from the Poetry Out Loud anthology. They will be able to recognize forms and devices and how those influence a poem's meaning. That is measured both in the unit exam at the end as well as in journal entries. And then finally, they will be able to recognize the ways in which tone and pacing are used to create poetic meaning. So the unit I'm going to talk about is a unit that takes approximately 9 class sessions, given that each class session is a 90-minute period. So I think for some schools or programs that have 50-minute periods, this could extend out to, more like 14 days. The 9-day unit I'm going to describe, though, does include, again, that unit exam. It also includes students doing a poetry reading prior to actually reciting. So there are some things that can be pulled out to shorten the unit down if the main objective was just to recite one poem. So on day one, then, when we introduce Poetry Out Loud, I typically have students with Google Chromebooks, and they would be accessing this website and becoming familiar with it while I'm introducing the unit. And I would invite them just to explore the site. Later on, I would be giving them pointers on things to go to. But overall, at the beginning, I just want them to become really familiar with this website. I also give the assignment sheet on that day so they know what they are going to be assessed on. That would include a description of the unit exam, the journal entry requirement, the writing of one original poem, reading one poem, and reciting one poetry out loud poem. From there, after introducing the unit and what's expected in the timeline, etc., I would be taking students and showing them some representative videos, either here on the Poetry Out Loud site itself or here through the YouTube channel. Each year I have a few go-to videos that I know that they really are inspiring, and so those are the ones I'll typically click on from this site. Since I went to the 2014 Nationals, or the 2013, excuse me, I tend to choose these ones because I met these students, and I guess it just has a little more a nostalgia for me, I guess. Some of these are really entertaining. The deliveries vary widely. All of these students and their recitations, though, are amazing, and my own students are typically motivated and inspired by what they're seeing students from their same age group accomplish. Again, back to that website in terms of teaching them how to browse for a poem. Sometimes just going through the alphabet here is not the most useful, or you may find that students get frustrated because they're not finding something that's catching them. So I often just refer students to the random poems. And since it's random, you never know what you're going to get. Every time I use this, I'm introduced to poets and poems I've never heard of. Sometimes I'll even just print an assortment of poems and I'll just hand them out to students who seem to not be finding anything. And oftentimes just giving them a poem is enough to get them going on memorizing a poem. A lot of those random poems I've handed out became the student's poem that got them to our school competition. An option here, again, for those units that will end in a summative exam, I will typically give a pre-assessment at the beginning just to find out what their current knowledge is of the poetic devices. I find that most students know what alliteration, metaphor, and simile are, but after that, there is a lot of stuff that they don't know. So that on day one that I would have sent students home with the objective of continuing to explore the website, they would have, probably a week to try to find a poem that they would sign up for. But as they come to class on day two, we would get right in on trying to understand poems. Poems on the surface can be very reluctant to deliver their meaning, and oftentimes even the title itself can frustrate a student to the point of just not being interested or wanting to just shut down. And so at the beginning it is useful to give them some tools so they can begin to analyze and break a poem down so they can begin to understand what it's saying. I think once they can, for the first time, grasp a message on their own, that itself can be inspiring because it's like that moment of, oh, now I see what they're doing. So part of that of the poems and part of their preparation for the exam then does require that they have access to a glossary. The Poetry Foundation has a great glossary. There's a lot of technical terms of prosody that I would never use in a high school class. So I have in the past chosen the ones that I think are appropriate for the high school level, such as allegory, alliteration, and allusion, and then I would copy and paste these and create my own glossary that would be provided through the Google Classroom or in a printed handout. But this is another valuable resource. And some of the poems that the students have chosen, they can find insights, essays, or other explications of those so they can help or get some help in understanding their poem. And from there, there is some instruction involved in teaching students how to explicate a poem, how to build their vocabulary, how to meticulously go line by line, writing in the marginalia questions, vocab words, identifying the metaphors, etc. in the poem. And typically I'll do this in front of the students and kind of model explicating using the overhead or the projector. And I typically use the new Decalogue as the example, and this is found on the Poetry Out Loud website. Many students are already familiar with the Old Testament, and this one allows them to make some discoveries because they can kind of build upon an understanding they already might have of the Old Testament. And you know, just by looking this one word up, it already gives them that sort of angle to then start counting the couplets and seeing that these are kind of like commandments. They're just new ones. So this is one that I do the talk out loud strategy with. As I'm reading each line out loud, they have a copy. They're writing in the marginalia. I'm asking questions as I read. I'm also giving explanations as I read to try to make sense of the poem. And from there, students are assigned a journal entry to explicate their own Poetry Out Loud poem, and that would require them to print the poem out, paste it or staple it into their journal, and then I would want to see the annotations, the notes, the questions, the paraphrasing, the summary writing all over that sheet as evidence that they are working at explicating a poem. From there we move into day 3. We continue with explication and working with the devices to just try to understand the messages of poems. And so this would be a day of group work. Students would be given random poems from Poetry Out Loud. In groups they would be assigned maybe stanzas, and then after working at trying to decipher those, then they would report back to the room, and as a group, as a whole class, we would come to an understanding of the poem through each group's explication of stanzas. Day 3 on my calendar here then it's about a week from the introduction of the unit, where I would have a sign-up sheet for students to choose the Poetry Out Loud poem that they are going to commit to reciting. This is also the time where I would have students start self-identifying if they were interested in maybe taking this to the next level and maybe think about a school-wide competition. And I would be encouraging those students at this stage to be thinking about a second poem and finding a second poem that they would also be memorizing. I know that some of the teachers, we kind of go back and forth in terms of if a student has chosen a poem in one of your classes, can another student recite the same poem? So do you want to hear, for example, 3 Annabelle Lees in one class? It seems like, I don't know if I'm saying her name right. Edgar Allan Poe poem. It's a real popular one for some reason. And previous to last year, I would always sort of say, you know, once you've chosen one poem, that's your poem. No other student can have it. But then when I look at the regional and state competitions, students do recite the same poems. So then I thought, well, I guess to emulate the experience, to make it look more like that, then I wouldn't restrict who chose what poems. Although I do publish and make visible students' names and the poems they chose, I don't prohibit those poems or duplication any longer. Day 4, we're going to move into poetic forms. There will be an introduction to the traditional sonnet, an introduction to free verse, and an introduction to the ballad with examples. Students would have been assigned in that initial assignment sheet that they would write one original work, and that would need to be either a sonnet, free verse, or ballad, and that original work would also be read out loud during an in-class poetry reading prior to the recitations. Those sonnets, or excuse me, those original works would need to occur or be evidenced in the poetry journal. And through the years, Poetry Out Loud website introduced me to this tabloid ballad idea, which is a kind of a humorous way to get students interested in writing poetry. And the tabloid ballad has an entire lesson plan devoted to it. It introduces students and teachers to the typical ballad format and the beats per line and the rhyme schemes and the alternate rhyme schemes. So we spend time going through this unit before we teach them this idea of what a tabloid ballad is. And basically a tabloid ballad is choosing like a pop culture topic, maybe something in the tabloid news. That becomes that kind of drives the content of the ballad, and then they create a kind of maybe humorous ballad, choosing the rhyme scheme and the metrical pattern, and they would emulate that in their tabloid ballad. So this is the unit that I typically use for the tabloid ballad, and here's an important part right here in section 3. On day 5 now, we're ready to move beyond just explication, which is sort of the, I guess, literal understanding of the poem, or figurative, literal understanding of the poem, your interpretation of the poem. This interpretation at this point is largely in your mind or on paper, so now it's time to make the poem have that, reveal that interpretation orally. How can you convey the message now, your unique interpretation, through your voice? And so this is the day when I will introduce students to the tone mapping unit. Again, a lesson plan provided on the Poetry Out Loud website. And in the tone mapping unit, it introduces students to the idea that not only are there a lot of different types of vocabulary words we use when we talk about tone, but that our ear actually understands this whole pantheon of tones that our voices can adapt. And so usually I will build on their expertise at tone that they already use, for example, with their parents, when asking questions that they know the answer to, etc. Before long, students realize that they do use tone a lot, and they use it in ways to maybe manipulate meaning, maybe to hide what their face says, etc. So I do try to build upon the tones that they already do use and are familiar with. I print this tone list out and I give them these words, and then I use the Jenny Kissed Me poem to show them a model of how one might map tones in a poem. And essentially, students are learning how to provide tone words to each line of poem. Now this one is based upon hearing it through the Poetry Out Loud CD, and you can find Jenny Kissed Me online also. And so I'll play it a couple of times and get students to look at the tone list and think about what they're hearing, see if they can match that to a tone word, and then I'll show them the example, and we'll talk about and maybe even argue about whether or not that was real regret. Other students would have different interpretations of the way Kate Ryan delivers this poem. And then after that's over, I will ask them to begin experimenting with their own poem and experimenting with their own voice and literally map their own poem out. This would be another journal entry so that I would see evidence that they did experiment using tone words with lines of poetry. And then I would encourage them to work in pairs in the hallway or whatever to experiment with those tones to see if they can really get their voice to match one of those tone words. So day 6 I put on here is again one of those alternatives or options. I like to give students some familiarity with being in front of the class with poetry. And so on this particular day, they're now ready to read one of their original works, and they can read it from their journal or from paper. I do ask them to be aware of their pacing, to be aware of not reading the poem too fast, to be conscious of their voice and how it's projecting. If they can, to also bring their eyes from the paper and start developing some eye contact. So we start building in some of those presentation performance skills through a reading, which I guess is a way to ease them into the recital where they will have no paper to look at. On day 7 then is a day where students are rehearsing, and this is a combination of pairs, small groups. I also just randomly call students to the front to do a dry run in front of the classroom. We can give them feedback using the contest evaluation sheet. Peers give each other feedback in the hallway. Some students are really, really nervous. They want to go hide with their friends somewhere. That's fine. I just want them to keep getting that poem out vocally, get their voice activated around the poem as much as possible. I'm going to show you that contest evaluation sheet here. You want to build this into the unit so that students are aware as they begin memorizing a poem exactly how they're evaluated. And in the instructor's guide, each of these criteria are explained in much greater detail in terms of what is involved with physical presence. I will spend this particular day going through in detail what each of these things means and entertain students' questions. This over here, this picture here is Brandon Zell and Mitchell Leneville at the regional contest in Beaverton last spring, and Mitchell did go on and win state last year and represented Oregon and Washington, D.C. I like this picture because it reminds me of the relationships that students develop through Poetry Out Loud. All of my participants through the years still stay in contact with the students they meet at regional, state, and at Washington, D.C. So it really does create an amazing network, and some of these students run Facebook sites now devoted to poetry, and all of their old friends from Poetry Out Loud are on their poetry Facebook site, etc. So it's another part of this that's not, I guess, part of the stated objectives, but it is a part that does develop. Okay, so on day 8, we are ready now for the in-class recitations. Students would have been shown their recitation lineup or schedule probably a class period before my class. It's not necessary because at regionals you don't really know the order that you're going to deliver your poem. And the size of your class could make this extend out beyond just one day. If you have time that you can build into your schedule, we typically do allow for redos. The first go around, students can be very nervous. They can rush through it. It doesn't get the best score. So oftentimes, I'll let everybody look at their scores, and then those who want to do a redo can. I would say only about half the students want to do a redo. Some of them, it was uncomfortable, they're happy to get it over with, and no thanks on the redo. Um, and then that's also the day where I would collect all of the journals. There might be 5 to 8 different journal entries I would collect on that day. And then we would begin, after the final recitation, we would be reminding the students that the end of the unit exam would be following the final day of recitations. Here I have listed some alternatives that I've used, and some of these are really useful. One is this idea of scoring a poem, and on the Poetry Out Loud website you would be able to see, I think, a lesson on scoring a poem. It didn't used to be there. I think it's been recently added. And you have students take out maybe a colored pencil or different colored pens and create a coding system on their poem so that maybe a red circle is something they would do when they want to emphasize certain words, and they would circle with those words with a red pencil. Anytime they want to pause, they might put a green exclamation point or a space bar, or the letter P, indicating this is somewhere they want to intentionally pause for effect, and it might not be a pause that the poet put in through a caesura mark like a comma or a colon. And then also a student would make a notation that gave them a reminder of how they might read that word in a suggestive way, in a way that might elicit desire, or a way that might elicit fear. So they would write that little word next to the word of the poem as a reminder when they are practicing with their tones and their pacing, so they can see it coded with these words here: emphasis, pausing, and suggested reading. Again, the tabloid ballad and writing other poems and original works, those are all alternatives to the poetry unit. You could successfully go through this unit and prepare a student to recite a poem without doing those things. However, it for greater practice. They can practice tonal variation and tempo with something they've written first without before they do it with a Poetry Out Loud poem. And again, that unit exam is an alternative for those who did want to have a summative assessment at the end of the unit in addition to the poetry recitation. Again, like I've mentioned both in this presentation and the one previously, this is the key resource for all of your Poetry Out Loud lesson plans, judge preparation, students' ability to browse poems, print poems, watch videos. It's a great website, has a ton of resources. It's the primary place to go. In addition, Poetry Foundation, the Glossary of Poetic Terms is something I use. And again, some poems that are in Poetry Out Loud will have analysis and even essay links to poems if the students want to dig a little deeper in understanding the message of their poem. And once again, at the end of this presentation, a list of the Common Core standards that would apply for a Poetry Out Loud unit embedded into a language arts setting. And that concludes this presentation on integrating a Poetry Out Loud unit into a language arts classroom. Thank you for your time, and hope to see you at or state competition.
Hi all, this is Deb, and wanted to thank you for being a part of this webinar. Mark, just so you know, I had to mute your phone to unmute mine this time. I'm not sure why, so if you're trying to say something, use the chat box. I want to thank you for being in attendance, and because we're done a little bit earlier than we had anticipated, just leave space if there's anybody on the webinar that has a follow-up question. You can use that chat box to type it in, and one of us will be happy to answer it. Also, I'm going to ask Clancy and Malka to once again pop up their email addresses in that chat box because maybe a question comes to you a few minutes after the webinar ends as you're moving through the rest of your Friday, and want you to have those email addresses handy so that you can get in touch with us. And Mark, you did a great job. We really appreciate you providing all of these resources, and just know that the webinar has been recorded so that it can be a resource to others. We hope this was helpful. Teachers, I know this is a busy time of the year as some of you are starting your first week of school. I know here in the Salem district we actually don't start school until next week, so we're still getting prepped here. And thank you for taking time out of your day to be with us. Not seeing any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and end the webinar. And just once again, thanks everybody for looking forward to a great year and looking forward to seeing all of you at the regional competitions in early March. So thanks so much. Have a great weekend.